Let's...
Shut up!
Let's talk about Oxenfree, a game that came out at the start of this year that I actually think is really interesting and not a lot of people really talked about. First of all, you don't kill anyone in Oxenfree, so that makes it kind of novel amongst games. Primarily your mode of interaction is communicating with people, just talking to people, which is great. And the people that you're talking to are teenagers, and teenagers are really interesting and fun because they have lots of emotions and hormones that maybe we've left behind and just kind of ignore these days. And thirdly, it's based on Steven Spielberg and Tobe Hooper's Poltergeist, which is one of my all-time favourite films. It kind of has a reverence towards the supernatural that a lot of ghost stories and horror games and films don't actually have. Night School Studio, the people behind Oxenfree, are made from ex-Telltale members, and I think that really shows in the game's design. But instead of this game being all about branching narratives, instead it's about how you can affect the tone of various interactions in the game. One of the big limitations in The Walking Dead was the fact that it kind of hoodwinked you when you got to choose what to do. X will remember this, but Y will they remember it? It never really matters. Sometimes you get to save a character in The Walking Dead, only for the game to kill them off later. It's not really you getting to author the story. So Oxenfree has a different tact. Like I said, it lets you affect the tone of the story. It lets you choose how to respond to situations, but only via dialogue. So instead of getting to author a story, you kind of get to author a character instead.
Right, now I'm back inside in a controlled environment with a script so I can actually focus on things clearly. So before moving on, let's clarify. The Walking Dead has every right to veto your decision in service of the story, in my opinion, but multiple playthroughs of it leave it feeling a little transparent. It's brilliant watching new people play it and get so invested in making their own stories, but it also shows up how hollow it can be to the person who's already played it. It's all smoke and mirrors, because the story plays out the same regardless of what you do. You can change certain things, characters dying here or there, only for the game to change it later. But the real kernel of interest in the story becomes the relationship between Lee and Clem, and your ability to put your own stamp on Lee's character when the game affords you that liberty. Oxenfree takes this further by giving you a scenario where your reactions can be much more exaggerated yet still accepted. And yeah, that's right, it gives you teens to play with in teenage movie scenarios.
And to answer your previous question, Jonas, the thing to do is lay on the beach and drink till you can't remember where you are.
And sometimes play Truth or Slap.
The game uses this pre-rendered scenario to help the characters rub up against each other in a typical teen movie tradition. Alex, the main character, is the quietly confident but slightly out there one of the group. Jonas is her stepbrother, a guy she doesn't really like too much, and he's a virgin addition to the group who's also a bit of a rough and ready rogue. And then there is Ren, the comedian of the group, and he's desperate to be liked as well and constantly flirting with all the girls. Then there's Clarissa, the style queen, preternaturally cool and perhaps a little bit cold because of it. And finally there's Nona, the weird tag-along who looks up to Clarissa perhaps a little bit too much. Now none of that is groundbreaking, it's all in the teen movie tradition, but it doesn't need to be groundbreaking because as ever the art is in the telling. Now the primary method of interaction in the game, as said before, is just dialogue, it's conversations. You choose how to respond from a set of responses, and most importantly you get to choose when to respond, and that changes things quite a lot. Alex can either be scornfully mute or impertinently bashful. She can cut people off or courteously wait for people to finish before making a suggestion. The way this works feels a lot like how word stress in a sentence works. So consider this following sentence and how the stress changes the way that it works. Why did she talk to him? Can also be why did she talk to him? Or why did she talk to him? Or why did she talk to him? Now that's pretty simple stuff, pretty much like elementary stuff when it comes to how language works. But in a game it works slightly different. The way that you can cut off people or wait for them to finish, coupled with the tone of the response, ends up being incredibly important to your perception of the character and the way that the player responds to them. It ends up even being more important than the kind of arbitrary binary decisions that give stories an illusion of reflexivity so frequently in video games. But I just want to be clear, that isn't to denigrate those type of games. I love those choices in games, but I do feel they're very limited. The legwork and programming that has to go into making a truly branching narrative is prohibitive and massive, and publishers are perhaps very reticent to front the money for content that they perceive to be wasted or not seen. And when you look at the given stats for completion of a lot of games on Steam, it's perhaps incredibly understandable why publishers just don't want to put money out there for content that might never be seen by 75% of people that play the game. So before carrying on, here's just a tiny excerpt from the start of the game that shows just how you can imprint your image of Alex onto the conversations.
Alex? Hey, still with us? You haven't said anything for like 10 minutes. Mission control to Alex. This is Big Papa. Do you read me? Yeah, Jonas, what you're seeing right now is what I like to call a trip. This blank stare thing Alex will do sometimes. You might think something's wrong, but there isn't. She's just rebooting. Alex? Hey, still with us? You haven't said anything for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, sorry.
So you all moved in?
Not really. I just got in this morning.
So now you understand how it works, and it's kind of impressive at times. It almost feels seamless. When it doesn't, it kind of breaks the illusion slightly, but when it does work, it looks brilliant. It works really, really well, and it's a method that I really hope other developers explore with conversations. And so that's one of Oxenfree's great strengths. Its depth comes from its writing rather than its narrative structure, even though that structure is quite self-reflexive and at times very metatextual. It's all about endings and video games and replaying branching narratives to try and get new effect. And so with that, let's just pop outside quickly again to the land of rambling thoughts and strange rituals in trees, apparently.
There's a school of thought in gaming that seems to suggest that having branching narratives and lots of endings is really, really good. But you only need to take a look at a handful of books and films to realise that endings are really hard to do, and to be honest, some of them are really fucking bad. With branching narratives, the problem that you have is you have to write 3 endings then, or you can do the Mass Effect 3 thing and just present 3 variations of the same ending and pretend that that was your intention all along. But what this viewpoint tends to ignore is that the stories that we can tell on the way to the ending can also be really, really good. So in Oxenfree, the narrative is locked, you can't change it. But you can alter the relationships between characters on the way, which is always far more interesting than changing the actual course of events.
Right, back again, real world. Gaming is no stranger to big, overarching, grand narratives about good and evil, about conflict, about epic stories that are all pretty homogenous when you think about it. So the one thing that games don't tend to get right, that films, TV and books tend to get right, is character narrative, but those narratives are still there. Whilst a lot of people think that Mass Effect's ending destroys the entire series and means that it's all awful, there's a preceding 90 odd hours of gameplay and story. What about Mordin Solace in the Genophage, or the Geth-Quarian conflict? The characters that turn up and involved in those storylines were pretty well written in my eyes, and though their conclusions had little impact to the overall denouement of the series, they're still my primary memory of the games. They gave texture and life to the universe. Although there was the ability to play Renegade and Paragon, it was kind of ridiculously binary, and those choices frequently felt hamstrung by the desire to tie it into some big overarching impact that the player could have in the universe, and they were less interesting than just simply telling good stories, and giving the player some wiggle room to determine various responses and their portrayal of Shepard within those stories. And so what I hope I'm conveying here is that the reason that Oxenfree works is because it gives you a tonal variation in your ability to approach situations, and then it ties those ideas into their narrative. Now I'll put a spoiler warning here because I know a lot of people haven't played it, but Oxenfree's narrative is all about the inability to change things. It's about being locked into a cycle or a predetermined decision with no ability to change it. It effectively resists multiple playthroughs that attempt to eke different results from its narrative, because in the end there is only one result. And the immutability of that narrative is at odds with the flexibility you have as a player to express yourself. If Ren pisses you off, you can cut him short. If Clarissa is being prissy, as to show off... If Clarissa is being prissy, as she so often is, you can be sarcastic back at her and elicit the appropriate response, or she can totally ignore you. But the narrative never really changes, but your experience of it really does. Now, given the game's underlying plots of events that can't be changed, such as the death of family members or past tragedies, it makes sense that it's then impossible to change the game's conclusions. So it focuses on the relationships between characters. You can change those subtly. The ending does counter your responses to various decisions, but overall the narrative itself is entirely inflexible. And to me, that seems pretty much the best concession that we can make when telling these types of stories. Of course, to some degree, it's going to be unsatisfying to certain people. The story has wobbly foundations with an impractical time loop thing going on. But again, sometimes art is just in the telling rather than the overall structure and finality of it. It doesn't really matter if it ends up wonky if you enjoyed all of it. And that was the issue that I had with a lot of the criticism about Mass Effect. It may have had a total farce of an ending, but fucking hell, it was great getting there. It was 90 hours of huge epic space adventures that made me feel like I was the captain of my own spaceship. It was a nerd's dream come true. And this is one of the reasons that I love Oxenfree, is because the telling is fantastic. I said originally that its main method of interaction was conversation, but its secondary method of interaction is via a dinky pocket radio. And that ends up being something that manages to evoke a sense of wonder and fear in a way that a lot of games just simply don't manage.
It's, dead.
To use a particularly wanky phrase here, Oxenfree is about the romantic mysticism of analog technology, the idea that there can be something between two fixed points, a specific in-between. And that's why Poltergeist is such a huge touch point for Oxenfree. It works on the premise that something in between life and death might be able to interact with analog signals on TVs to communicate. And to talk about films for a second, the modern remake suffers a lot in this respect due to its decision to set itself in the modern day. Digital things corrupt, but they're so fixed, so enshrined, they're 1 or 0, there's very little in between, that it feels really weird for them to be a medium for the conversation of ghosts. Now, Alex's little radio in Oxenfree works so well because it allows you to skip between signals here and there, snippets of things, whispers of songs and dialogues and radio transmissions and number stations that all intermingle with strange static and the sharp prangs of weirdness that are your goals when sifting through all of these frequencies. There's an incredible sense of mysticism about it, that you're playing with something that shouldn't be played with, that if you then go off in your own home and start tuning your radio to strange AM stations, you might find something you maybe didn't want to hear.
It would have been better had it never been found. For all those who possess came the sudden and violent.
And that strangeness ensures that there's always a great payoff to the ramping up of the sounds that you have to home in on. At times, locating a specific frequency in Oxenfree feels like being forced to look around a corner that you know has something horrible around it. And the game has a few jumps and moments that make its 2D presentation work really well. There's something really impressive about the simplicity of it all, and how it just gets to your core and really affects the way that you feel. To carry on being wanky, because at heart I am a massive wanker, I feel like this is maybe Ludo-narrative harmony. This is two things working together in a way that reinforces them. There's the mutability of a teenager's appearance, their projection of themselves amongst their peers, and the wavy, woozy in-betweenness of the supernatural world and analog technology. These three things all mesh together. In my opinion, it's very similar to why you see analog synth scores turn up in horror films so much. I know they've become iconic because of specific films, but I think they repeat themselves over and over again as a theme because we just love that idea of something that's not quite within our control. It's not hard yes and it's not hard no. And it's the same in Oxenfree. We don't need to be able to impact a plot or narrative massively, we just need to feel it have a little give. And because we're people, the way that we like to see it give is in its characters. We want to be able to mould them and shape them. We want to be able to perform, and it's why games are so frequently linked to theatre, although you won't often see a lot of things written about that. It's primarily in academia from what I've seen. but there's this essence of performativeness in Oxenfree that works so well with its teen movie homage setting and its weird supernatural background. And after all this praise, I think it's probably time just to get into one or two little things that I didn't like about the game. It's only fair, I think. First of all, there's a big fetch quest at the end that doesn't need to happen. You can uncover the true background of the story and the island by going between these little cairns of rocks everywhere and tuning your radio in, but by the time you get to this point, the radio upgrade that you've been given means it's a little bit laborious. Also, it's very, very easy to miss some of them, and all of this stuff I feel just should come naturally in the game. There shouldn't be a tacked-on quest right at the very end. And secondly, yeah, its narrative doesn't really work. I don't think that's a huge problem because it's trying to tell a very specific story and it has to make some concessions to that story, and so it has to break rules that we have about time travel and yada yada yada. None of this stuff exists, so in the end that didn't end up being a huge problem for me because the characters were really appealing and I really enjoyed the rest of my time with it. Other people will be far less forgiving of those things. You might be one of those people that is far less forgiving of those things. I'm just trying to give my honest perception of this game. I feel like its strengths far outweigh its weaknesses. There's not a lot of games like it out there, and I feel that's one brilliant reason to try it. But second of all, it's pretty beautiful. The music's spot on, the aesthetics are fantastic. Overall, it's a very hard experience to begrudge just because of a few missteps here and there. And again, slight spoilers here, but I feel like I wouldn't be able to properly analyse the game or look at it without talking about this very briefly, is its online component. It's very, very small. It's possibly influenced by Dark Souls and other games like that in the way, and also Maya, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the game where once you've finished it, you have to wait for an email to tell you what other people's responses to your responses to the game was in like an endless daisy chain of coolness. Oxenfree riffs on this in a similar way, where you see reflections of yourself at certain parts in the game when things are getting trippy and weird and spooky, and what happens is you see a version of Alex, and it will sometimes talk to you and give you responses. Now what you're seeing is not your responses or premeditated responses that the game has chopped up for you, but you're seeing other people's actual responses, and you can sometimes make out their Steam name above them too. And I feel like that kind of touches on what I was just talking about there with performance and mutability. It lets you see that there's other ways to be Alex, there's other responses that you can have, and later on you get to go back and you get to give your own responses to that in turn another player will hopefully see in the future. And this all ties into its storyline, which is all kinds of nonsense about time travel and interdimensions and gaps between things, and I really like that as a kind of idea for a game. So with that minor deluge of games criticism wank speak out of the way, I'm just going to take one last walk outside into the world of freewheeling thoughts that hadn't been rehearsed a lot before I did them, to just cap off everything.
Oxenfree isn't perfect, and neither is Firewatch, but both of these games are thrusting towards the same conclusion, and that is that there's a different way to tell stories. Stories in games don't need to be about changing what happens. You don't need to have a huge impact on the game world for it to matter. You can just change your response to these actions. You can change how your characters react, and that's quite rare in games, and it's strange to wonder why. Overall, I feel like Oxenfree and Firewatch are games that shy away from the binary decisions of good or bad and get us into more grey, ambiguous territory that's far more interesting to explore in a video game than battles between good and evil. And that's why I think you should give Oxenfree a go.
What the?
Hello? Dear, tell everyone.
Hello?
As ever, thanks for watching, it really means a lot to us. Things have been slow the past couple of weeks, but hopefully we've got a couple more videos coming up in the next month or so to sort that out. Filming outside was a bit of an experiment. I don't know if it really worked too well. If you want to let us know in the comments below, that'd be brilliant. Or even if you want to subscribe or share our videos with other people, that'd be fantastic too. We'll see you later.